Hello, and welcome back to Podfinder. My name is Philip, and I'm here to talk about Pathfinder 2nd Edition. This is part of a series I'm producing covering the various deities, factions, and NPCs in the Pathfinder role-playing game and its setting, the world of Golarion. Today, I'll be continuing this month's focus on the vampires of Golarion with an examination of Zura, the demon lord of vampires. For a more general discussion of vampires in the Pathfinder setting, check out my previous video, in which I talk through it all with Jake from Wisdom Check. It was a pretty fun time, but this video is back to my more traditional deep dive format. While many deities exist which claim ownership or patronage of vampirism more broadly, Zura is certainly the most famous of them all. Her origins trace back to the ancient Aslanti Empire, and some legends claim that she is even the first vampire to have risen from the grave. Zura's cult exists largely in secret, but in the rare instances when they reveal themselves, they unerringly strike fear into the hearts of civilians the world over. Before that, though, if you enjoy this video and want to hear more Pathfinder lore, consider subscribing or commenting below. With that out of the way, let's move on to the rundown. Zura, the Queen of Vampires, is a demon lord, a lesser deity on the order of the Psychopomp Ushers, the Infernal Dukes of Hell, or the benevolent Imperial Lords, like Arshay or Ashava, whom I've covered before. Zura is the patron deity of vampiric predation, and she doesn't discriminate between violent, unhinged animalistic slaughterers and refined, genteel, exploitative nobles. Despite this, many of Zura's faithful tend to be noble elites of one form or another, likely due to the goddess's own origins as a noblewoman in ages past. Followers of Zura crave eternal life, consuming the blood of their victims with voracious enthusiasm to ensure their continued survival and indulgence. Nothing will stand in their way, and no depravity is too extreme. Zura has some degree of power over her appearance. Like many deities, she's able to manifest herself before followers with an avatar which varies in its presentation to one degree or another. Her chosen appearance is typically that of a beautiful and stately noblewoman. To some followers, she appears as youthful and voluptuous, leaning into her interests in seduction. To others, she appears older, taking on a more stately role, and leaning into her role as a mistress to be served. Behind all these facades, however, lies Zura's true appearance. Zura takes the form of an emaciated human woman, her skin stretched tight over her bones. Though her torso is naked, her long flowing hair, drenched in blood, covers her breasts. Instead of arms, a pair of leathery bat wings extend from her shoulder sockets. Each wing is covered in swirling demonic runes, and blood trails from each wingtip. Her mouth, sometimes stained with blood, is filled with sharp predatory fangs. Her eyes glow blood red, and her feet end in talons like those of a harpy. She has held several titles over her reign as a demon lord, including She Who Savors Flesh during the Aslanti period and Demon Lord of Cannibals and Vampires in more recent years. Interestingly, we know Zura was once a mortal woman, specifically a noblewoman in ancient Aslant. Unfortunately, no records exist which depict or describe her mortal appearance. Presumably, she was a human woman of Aslanti ethnicity, but beyond that, little is known about how she looked or presented herself. Broadly, she likely dressed in extravagant and wealthy styles, but also incorporated blood imagery and other death-related aesthetic elements. Zura makes her home in Nesh, a pocket of the Outer Rifts, which serves as her personal deific domain. Nesh is a realm of mountains and valleys, evocative of the landscape of Transylvania. The realm is shrouded in eternal night, and the sky looks eerily similar to the night sky of Golarion. The weather in Nesh is broken down into three broad regions: the frozen peaks and glaciers on one end, the humid jungles on the other, and the chilly, craggy foothills in the middle. Unlike many divine realms, Nesh plays host to a large number of mortal humanoids. These poor souls have been kidnapped from their homes in the material plane by Zura and her servants, deposited into Nesh to serve as prizes, objects of ownership for the Queen of Vampires to lord over, and to feed upon when the mood strikes her. The mortal occupants of Nesh gather into small settlements scattered across the realms. They live in constant fear and misery, beset by the horrors around them. That said, they are ultimately protected by Zura herself, whose pride and power prevent unchecked predation upon her playthings. The extent to which any one of these mortals even realizes that they are in the outer rifts is unclear, though it seems that most do not. Leaders among the mortals often conspire with Zura's servitors to ensure docility among the humanoids. Much like Urgathoa, Zura's teachings are extremely self-centered and indulgent. She encourages her followers to consume blood, but more broadly to consume resources heedlessly, with no regard for the concerns of others. Zura herself is defined in large part by her bottomless hunger for all things: blood, flesh, wealth, and above all, power. She passes this gluttonous hunger along to her followers, who are commanded to gather resources, exploit those beneath them, and pursue vampiric immortality so their consumption might never end. According to Zura, the ritual consumption of flesh or blood would pass along the strengths and skills of the victim, empowering the devourer. She even teaches this to non-vampires, leading to the prominence of her faith among cannibals. More disturbing interpretations of this lesson result in grotesque displays of bloodlust and exploitation, from bathing in the blood of the young to weaving wigs from the hair taken from corpses of young girls. As a sign of the importance of this consumption, Zura's listed fiendish obedience from 1E commanded the consumption of blood, which then gave the imbiber greater resistance to the powers of other undead beings. More powerful followers could even purge their bodies of diseases and poisons, and provide them with a bonus on attack rolls and skill checks. Followers of Zura are actively encouraged to become vampires. Non-vampire followers certainly exist, but they are the exception rather than the rule, and no follower would ever actively pursue any form of undeath beyond vampirism. Beyond just commanding her faithful to become vampires, Zura also forbids her followers from exposing the secret world of vampires to outsiders. Followers of Zura are encouraged to protect vampiric society, and to safeguard the success of vampire kind more broadly. These commands and teachings are passed along to followers not through a formal holy text, but by formal priests and learned vampiric scholars. Followers of Zura do use written documents to pass along their beliefs, practices, and teachings, but these documents are largely decentralized, seemingly because Zura hasn't seen fit to formalize a text of her own. Because the faith of Zura is largely criminalized and hunted throughout the Inner Sea region, followers of Zura tend to produce their own books of faith in secret, encoding their work such that it is only discernible to the author and their immediate agents, co-conspirators, and underlings. These documents generally take the form of personal journals, and include entries on daily schedules, appointments, important addresses, notable contacts, and even favorite recipes. All of these entries can hide information on the author's vampiric activities, from identifying other vampires to listing reliable sources of food or especially memorable feedings. Due to this practice of encoding, followers likely have expertise in the society skill, or some other skill which might be used to decipher writing. Regardless of how they receive Zura's teachings, followers of Zura almost universally interpret a single command as their primary directive: become a vampire. Zuran priests and devout worshippers seek vampirism as the ultimate goal of their faith, and only once this goal is achieved do they feel actualized to further explore and personalize their interpretation of Zura's edicts. The importance of this quest was so tantamount that, back in 1E, the culmination of Zura's fiendish obedience was to temporarily grant the powers of a vampire to her living mortal followers. In many cases, followers seeking vampirism would begin establishing nocturnal schedules even before they had transformed, to be better adapted to their eventual need to avoid the sun. Sometimes, a person's pre-existing inclinations to violence, indulgence, or cannibalism led them to Zura's faith and the quest for vampirism. Other times, the desire for eternal life led to a quest for vampirism, which led to faith in Zura, and in turn, bloodletting and cannibalism. Zura herself doesn't care about the means by which her followers come to her faith. As a result of this diversity of origins among Zura's faithful, they often are divided into two broad but very different categories. The first of these are the murderous butchers, the lone killers who stalk the night and prey upon victims one at a time. These are serial killers, solo murderers who see themselves as apex predators, and who strike fear into the communities they prowl. Some of these individuals might live double lives, with public-facing personas who engage with their community, and private personas who indulge in their base desires. Others who fit this archetype might completely abandon the public mask entirely and embrace a life outside of society, hidden in the shadows until they emerge from the darkness to identify and hunt a new target. The other major category of Zura's faithful are the classical aristocratic vampire covens. These followers almost universally hide in plain sight, using their wealth and power to obscure their predatory nature. These Zurans are largely defined by their indulgence. They live in rich, enormous mansions, drink fine wine, eat rich food, wear expensive clothes, and host magnificent parties. While their faith in Zura is almost certainly hidden from the public, rumors may swirl in their social circles about their true nature, but fear, wealth, and political power keep the other nobles in line. These covens likely have servants who do their hunting for them, and who lure unwitting victims from the dredges of society who won't be missed. From an aesthetic perspective, these aristocratic vampires will likely incorporate the more seductive and subtle aspects of vampirism into their daily lives. These are also the followers most likely to focus on political machinations, manipulating the legal and social systems around them to empower themselves and spread their depravities to others. In this case, they parallel Zura's rise to power through the manipulation of her family members and the nobles around her. Another parallel which these aristocratic vampires might draw to their demonic mistress might be the tendency to set up shop in an isolated castle in the distant countryside, lording over local peasants and serfs with no outside authority to challenge them. If the vampire in question isn't wealthy enough to afford a castle or mansion in such a village, they might take up the role of a newly arrived priest, obscuring their true faith so they might lead the local peasantry astray. For an excellent source of inspiration on this, check out Mike Flanagan's Midnight Mass on Netflix. Nearly all Zurans understand the vitriol with which they and their goddess are viewed, and choose to exist in secrecy as a result. The Zuran Church is highly decentralized, and individual worshippers and covens rarely come into contact with one another. For this reason, universal aphorisms and celebrated holidays are almost unheard of in Zura's church. Zuran turns of phrase generally involved the acts of eating or drinking, and might use words like feast or thirst in ways which would be seen as innocuous to the uninitiated. Funnily enough, however, these phrases are sometimes used by elder vampires in the church to suss out overeager new converts. If a new vampire or prospective vampire hears such a phrase and responds too visibly or enthusiastically, they might be marked as unworthy of trust, or even as a potential liability, which must be eliminated. Holidays among Zurans are similarly varied, but are almost all marked by a feast of blood. Many Zurans might celebrate the anniversary of their vampiric transformation, as a twist on the traditional birthday. While these turning days are likely celebrated in private, vampires who rule over a community might instead host annual community-wide parties. These usually have a public-facing excuse, like a harvest festival or a winter solstice, but also serve as discrete opportunities for the ruling vampires to select a victim and ritualistically prey upon them. Over many years, these celebrations might slowly become dreaded by the local populace, as the villagers and peasants realize that at least one strange death accompanies these holidays every year. Despite the diversity among Zura's faithful and the relative isolation between groups, there is one other unifying belief among nearly all Zurans. Devout Zurans believe that Zura herself was the first vampire to rise from the dead. This is challenged by several factors, however. The strigoi, the earliest noted species of vampire, have their origins in the Netherworld, and have no apparent connection to historic Aslant or Zura. According to the Whispering Way, who are among the most accomplished, if biased, necromantic scholars on all of Golarion, the strigoi were allowed into the material plane for the first time during the Age of Darkness, after Earthfall and the collapse of Aslant. At the same time, Urgathoa, the patron goddess of undeath generally, predates Zura by at least many centuries, probably many millennia. Still, Zurans insist that their goddess was the first risen vampire, and no concrete evidence has ever arisen to contradict that claim. That said, if such evidence were to exist, the Church of Zura would almost certainly seek it out and destroy it. Both temples and shrines to Zura are commonly hidden away in the secretive dark corners of the world. This practice traces back to the earliest days of the cult of Zura in ancient Aslant after her initial ascension. These cultists needed to practice their faith in layers of secrecy. This, coupled with the vampiric aversion to sunlight, often drove the faithful underground, both literally and figuratively. Cave systems, catacombs, and other subterranean complexes are popular places of communion among the faithful. These fortresses of the faith are often simple when they are founded, but become increasingly ornate throughout their life cycle. The oldest active temples exist as hidden underground palaces beneath major cosmopolitan cities, which provide a reliable source of food. These facilities come equipped with feasting halls and space for profane rites involving human sacrifice. The extravagance of these temples appeals to the expensive tastes of the nobles who gravitate toward Zura's faith. In the case of especially wealthy adherents to Zura's faith, they might create a secret hidden room in the bowels of their palace or castle. These tend to be small personal shrines, intended for the room's owner and their immediate followers. Successfully establishing a Zuran temple is typically a methodical process, one which must be undertaken with care and secrecy, in order to maintain the cult's security. Cultists might begin the process following the Count Dracula model, acquire a large and preferably abandoned piece of property with plenty of basement space. From there, they begin the process of establishing their new hunting grounds, exploring the cities and towns in the vicinity, setting boundaries and schedules for when and where they can hunt, and making alliances with the living power players in the region. I mentioned that this process must be undertaken with care because the vampires need to worry about drawing undue attention to themselves. This attention might come from humans and Pharasmans, but might also come from other vampires, who might worry that a competing group of hunters could impact their own ability to feed. Vampires in Ustalav, for instance, have been known to eliminate particularly violent or disruptive new cults, which set up in their territory. I've shown here the text of a letter from the semi-famous vampire Ramoshka Arkminos in Ustalav, who's attempting to hire a group of warriors to exterminate a new coven of youthful vampires near the Dotrot Ranch, because they might draw the wrong sort of attention. While vampires are careful to watch out for one another and avoid collective exposure to the public, this tendency is ultimately selfish in nature. To Zurans, the world is a dog-eat-dog, or in this case bat-eat-bat, place, and when the chips are down, it's every vampire for herself. History and Legends. Zura is one of the relatively few deities on Golarion whose history is fairly well documented, though a few specifics still remain unclear. Zura began her life not as a demon, but as a mortal, a girl born to a normal family in an isolated corner of ancient Aslant. Her family was wealthy and powerful, and some sources refer to her as a princess and later a queen. In her youth, however, she was the sixth child in the family, and the only daughter. Even as a youth, Zura was a sociopathic monster. Desperate for her family's seat of power, she developed her skills as a social manipulator, playing her parents and siblings against one another with carefully placed words and fits of entitled fury. She reveled in the turmoil she caused, watching the family whom she saw as little more than tools and obstacles squirm under her secret manipulations, transformed from a loving family into a paranoid, unhinged collection of mongrels. Zura used her control over her parents to slowly push them into ever darker and more twisted pastimes, culminating in grisly parties featuring torture, murder, and eventually even cannibalistic rituals. After methodically killing each of her brothers in a way which obscured her involvement, she officially became the heir, despite the nation's patriarchal inheritance laws. This allowed her to put the final phase of her wicked plans into action. On the eve of her 20th birthday, Zura convinced her mother to kill her father and serve him for dinner in celebration. Zura rewarded her mother's loyalty with a knife, then stepped over the corpses of her parents to seize the throne. Her ascension heralded suffering for her people, as she coerced the nobles of the region into joining her twisted indulgences, teaching them dark rites which would grant them eldritch power by consuming the flesh of their fellow humans. Zura's indulgences during this period knew no limits, and the scale of her depravity was unmatched. Innumerable grotesque banquets graced her halls, where sentient beings were sacrificed and served upon polished silver plates. Jeweled goblets overflowed with blood and wine, and orgies of murderous lust filled her chambers. This depravity only continued to win the loyalty of her bannermen, and her legions of loyal retainers grew. Of course, legends of this debauchery soon made their way to neighboring kingdoms in Aslant, but the arrogant kings of the empire refused to believe that such evil could take root in their grand homeland. As time passed and the rumors persisted, however, eventually investigators were sent. None of them ever returned. Finally, the kings of Aslant set out in force to confront this strange queen in their midst, and what they found horrified them. The rumors, impossible as it seemed, were true, and if anything, failed to capture the sickening displays of moral corruption. Even upon this discovery, however, Zura was not so easily destroyed. Her legions of followers hurled themselves at the Aslanti kings, buying time for their queen to work some dark miracle. But such a miracle never came to pass. Zura's lecherous life came to an end, not at the hands of some righteous crusader, but at the hands of one of her many lovers. Some accounts claim that her death amounted to a mistake, a ritual orgy soaked in freshly spilled blood which went wrong somehow, and resulted in Zura accidentally engineering the method of her own death. Other sources claim that a lover finally broke and drove their knife into the queen's heart. Either way, her body did not remain. Zura's corpse disappeared in a cloud of smoke which consumed the flesh of the one who killed her, and thus the reign of the cannibalistic queen of Aslant ended. But Zura's story was far from over. Her soul, so corrupted by lust and gluttony, manifested quickly in the outer rifts and coalesced into a new form, a unique vampiric succubus. From here, the tale becomes a bit murky. Some scholars claim that she began picking off her fellow demons, murdering her enemies and consuming them to gain power and build up an army of loyal followers. Others claim that she sought out the patronage of Urgathoa and used the backing of the Pallid Princess to carve out a realm for herself in the Outer Rifts. What isn't debated is the result of this campaign. Zura cemented herself as a demon lord, a demigoddess of the abyss who had dominion over vampires alongside broader interests in the night, seduction, and cannibalism. In her wake, she left the drained corpses of many demon lords of necromancy and undeath, all of whom failed to stand against her. Back in ancient Aslant, the memories of Zura were slow to fade. Though her few surviving distant relations were quick to change their names and abandon their titles, whispers persisted about the dead queen whose lust for blood brought a whole kingdom to its knees. Some, particularly those in positions of power, still held on to the lessons of Zura. They saw in her an example of what they'd always desired, a life where they could abuse and exploit those beneath them, heedlessly take from the masses without fear or concern for the well-being of lesser men and women. In Zura, they saw a model, and as they secretly attempted to emulate her actions in life, they soon began to hear her whispers in their hearts. In the hidden corners of Aslanti noble society, the cult of the Vampire Queen took root, and it slowly began to grow over the following centuries. The cult formed in back rooms and secret social clubs, kept hidden behind gilded gates and beneath vast estates. The faith passed between wealthy elites by word of mouth and exclusive invitation. The desire to exploit others, to figuratively consume their strength to feed one's own, slowly became more literal over time, opening the way for increased levels of violence and murder in the cult. The cult of Zura further ensured its secrecy by actively cultivating relationships with noble and wealthy families across Aslant and beyond. Zurans developed the practice of inviting these nobles to parties under false pretenses, then forcing them to observe and participate in violent and debased rituals. By forcing this participation, the Zurans made the nobles complicit in their dark deeds, buying their silence with blackmail, bribes, and threats. So deep was the corruption of Zura's faith that even the devastation of the Earthfall calamity failed to eradicate it. In the Age of Darkness, the cult of the Vampire Queen persisted, and, by the time of the Age of Anguish and beyond, they had become too widespread to ever be completely destroyed. Some scholars even speculate that, had Earthfall not destroyed the Aslanti civilization, the corruption of Zura would have eventually brought the Empire to its knees. Locations of the Faith. On Golarion today, the faith of Zura is small but widespread. Cults, to she who consumes flesh, are found throughout the Inner Sea region, though they exist almost entirely in secret outside of Geb, the Gravelands, and the Isle of Dread. The wealthy and powerful are overrepresented among their ranks, due in large part to that practice of noble recruitment I discussed earlier. In Cheliax, for example, members of noble families are often seduced into Zura's faith, and practice their beliefs in secret, for fear of the Hell Knights and the House of Thrun. In Nidal, Zura's faith is practiced with less fear, as vampires and undead are able to partake in Zon-Kuthon's dark torturous rituals with relative ease. Even so, Zurans are viewed as somewhat subversive to the rule of the Black Triune, and must be careful not to draw the wrong sorts of attention. Ustalav, of course, plays host to numerous vampiric organizations, many of which are devoted to Zura. Here, the vampires can expect the support of the Whispering Way, but must always be on the lookout for opposition from the Knights of Lastwall or the Esoteric Order of the Palatine Eye. In Belkzen, a number of orc tribes, namely the Dead Eye Hold in the Kodor Mountains and the Twisted Nail Hold in the Mindspin Mountains, are known for their cannibalistic practices. Many of these orcs have found their way to Zura's faith, embracing her teachings and pursuing vampirism. Vampire orcs often lead these groups, and encourage their followers to seek life underground, only emerging at night to hunt their prey. One interesting note on the prevalence of Zura's faith is its presence among the Bekyar and Koboto peoples of the Mwangi Expanse and the Sodden Lands. Now, before I describe this, I should make a huge caveat by clarifying that most of this information comes from old 1E sourcebooks and is pretty outdated. This information is rooted in some pretty biased and insensitive cultural views, and I wouldn't be surprised if we got a complete rewrite of this lore someday. Some groups of the Bekyar in the Sodden Lands worship Zura alongside other fiendish deities like Dagon and Angazan. The Koboto peoples, descended from the rulers of the submerged nation of Yamasa, worship Zura as one of their three feasters, gods of consumption, which they refer to as the Sar Gorog. The three deities are Urgathoa, Rovagug, and Zura. There are also some notes on halflings in the Kava lands who worship fiends including Zura. The lore surrounding these halflings, in particular, does not appear to have been overwritten by the Mwangi Expanse book in 2E. Finally, a small number of Aslanti vampires still keep Zura's faith, tending to ancient shrines which date all the way back to Zura's initial rise to power. Not much detail has been provided on these vampires. Relationships. As a demon lord, Zura is despised by nearly all non-evil deities, and is considered a rival to most evil deities besides. The vast majority of the demon lords of the Outer Rifts are highly competitive, and generally work against one another in the absence of an external unifying threat, or an external victim to bully. While Zura and her followers will occasionally ally themselves with similar demon lords, like Cabriri or Orcus, these alliances are generally short-lived and matters of convenience, except in locations like Geb or the Isle of Terror, where the state apparatus encourages and enforces cooperation. Zura does have a long-standing loose alliance with a group of deities focused on predation, violence, and generally nocturnal behavior. This pantheon, called the Children of the Night, consists of Camazotz, Nin, Urgathoa, Yejing, and Zura. The Children of the Night are a collection of gods who have agreed to generally work together in order to preserve themselves and their followers. The followers of this pantheon's member deities are individuals whose identities must be kept secret, generally because the broader communities in which they live would kill or exile them if they were discovered. These are people like assassins, vampires, or other beings who must exist in the dark hidden corners of the world. Because these mortals, and to a lesser extent the gods they worship, are threatened by society if they choose to live openly, it is to all of their benefit to work together and watch one another's backs. That said, tempers have been known to flare up between member deities from time to time, so this alliance isn't absolute by any means. Unsurprisingly, good deities almost universally despise Zura, and oppose her actions at every turn. Pharasma, as the most prominent deity in opposition to undeath, despises Zura, and priests of Pharasma sometimes specialize in combating vampires. Similarly, Sarenrae and Iomedae, who both oppose undeath as well, encourage their followers to oppose Zura and her faithful. Other deities opposed to undeath and demons, like Desna, Ashava, Regathiel, or Vildeus, among many others, all oppose Zura's faith. Even deities of community, like Abadar or Erastil, would vehemently oppose Zura's activities. Servants of Zura take particular pleasure in infiltrating these opposing faiths, posing as followers of these benevolent deities, then corrupting the faithful from within. This long-term corruption mirrors Zura's destruction of her own family, and successfully bringing down an enemy church via this method is seen as particularly pleasing to the Queen of Vampires. To aid in this description, Zura never begrudges her followers offering false prayers to benevolent deities. This is speculation on my part, but I strongly suspect that Zura has an intense hatred for Nocticula, the recently ascended goddess of art and redemption. Nocticula was a demon lord prior to her ascension and ruled over the succubi. As a variant on a succubus, Zura would almost certainly have competed with Nocticula for dominance. At the same time, Nocticula was a climber in the hierarchy of the Outer Rifts, and assassinated her way up the ladder, causing most other demon lords to fear her. Nowadays, Zura has probably been picking away at Nocticula's former worshippers, and winning them to her side. At the same time, Zura likely still fears Nocticula, and worries that the goddess might seek to redeem her or her faithful, stripping them of their vile powers. One complex relationship, which is the subject of much speculation, is that which exists between Zura and Urgathoa. Urgathoa, the Pallid Princess, is the most powerful deity of undeath, and is in many ways the patron of all undead beings, vampires included. Urgathoa teaches the importance of limitless consumption and the value of indulgence. These lessons mirror many of the practices which Zura herself undertook in life, leading many to speculate that she might have secretly been a worshipper of Urgathoa all along. There's no direct evidence supporting this theory, however, and plenty of religious scholars believe otherwise. Still, the parallels between the two faiths are undeniable. Both focus their attention on undead followers. Both seek to corrupt other organizations, and both emphasize a connection between undeath and hunger or consumption. It's no wonder, then, that followers of both faiths are able to cooperate and commingle when the need arises with relative ease. Urgathoans and Zurans have been known to collaborate all across the Inner Sea region, especially in areas like Geb or the Isle of Terror, where higher authorities can keep them in line. Still, differences between the faiths inevitably arise given enough time, and the conflicts which erupt between them are exceptionally violent. Part of this conflict stems directly from the overlapping interests of the two goddesses. There are only so many gluttonous murderers who seek undeath. Both deities need to compete for a relatively small pool of potential followers, leading to jealous conflict. At the same time, there exist a few distinct doctrinal differences between the faiths which could also contribute to this tension. One such difference is the symbolic value which each faith assigns to blood. Zurans see blood as an energy source, a tool to be used. Their vampiric thirst for blood and ability to derive nourishment from it has led them to developing numerous magical rituals and machines which run on the magical properties of mortal blood. Urgathoans, by contrast, see blood as representative of life itself, not a pragmatic tool, but a symbol representing living existence. The act of draining blood is itself sacred, not the use of the blood for other purposes. If you think this is a nitpicky difference, just look up the theocratic debates held around the concept of transubstantiation all throughout real-world Christian history. For players who might be interested in playing characters who follow Zura, here are a few useful details. For those using the alignment rules, Zura is chaotic evil, but will also accept followers of neutral evil alignment. Her edicts are to drink blood, to seek vampirism, and to cause bleed damage. By contrast, to expose vampires for what they are, or to heal a bloody wound without first drinking blood from it, are both anathema to Zura. Notably, to destroy a vampire is not anathema to Zura in any way. Her holy symbol is a red skull with fanged teeth, though she also has a unique demonic rune from 1st edition. Her domains are disorientation, indulgence, nightmares, and undeath, though she also has the alternate domains of decay and swarm. She has the harm domain, and clerics and champions of Zura must choose unholy sanctification. Zura's sacred color is red. Much like a Chekik before her, she only has a single sacred color. Red, to a Zuran, is symbolic of one thing, and one thing only: blood. Followers of Zura might dress in red clothing or red accessories to show their faith, but many will simply drench themselves in the blood of their victims or enemies, and consider that a sufficient display of their faith. Because many nobles follow Zura, expensive and refined clothing is overrepresented among her faithful, from expensive jewelry to fashionable ball gowns and evening wear. Such followers are more common in regions which support a wealthy noble class. On the other end of the spectrum, followers of Zura who embrace the role of animalistic predators might adopt a more feral appearance, with rotting clothes covered in blood and gore, and little in the way of decoration. Zura's favored weapon is the rapier, an elegant blade which likely has origins in the culture of nobles who made up Zura's early faith. Many Zurans, especially those with positions of nobility, will gravitate toward this weapon, though I haven't seen any evidence of specific fighting styles practiced by the faith. Zurans who choose other weapons will likely gravitate toward weapons in the knife group, which will cause bleed damage with a critical hit. For similar reasons, the wounding property rune might be favored by followers of Zura. Wielding such weapons will allow devout Zurans to follow their goddess's edicts in regular combat. Claws and fangs are common among Zurans as well, due to the frequency with which vampires develop such natural weapons. Unsurprisingly, Zura's favored animal is the vampire bat, because how could it have been anything else? Other options likely include nocturnal predators, like wolves or big cats. Carrion birds or owls might be appropriate as well. Undead animal companions might be common among Zura's followers, as might undead familiars, like the talking head, the giant hand, or the polong. Within Zura's following, humans are the dominant ancestry, though this appears to be due to their status as the most numerous ancestry on Golarion more than any other factor. All mortal ancestries capable of being turned into vampires might be found among her faith, meaning only things like puppets, automatons, or androids would be left out. That being said, members of ancestries which do join her faith rarely remain in their living form for long, and the vast majority become vampires, either before or immediately after joining her cult. Dhampirs are overrepresented among her followers, as many of the children of vampires see Zura's faith as a path to acceptance. A few non-vampires who subsist on blood will also find the teachings of Zura appealing. Werebats are a good example, even if many of them are more easily drawn to Camazotz, and the same could be true of werebat-descended beastkin. Similarly, the Sabasans, bat-like humanoids from the Mwangi Expanse, are drawn to her faith. Another example, albeit an odd one, might be an awoken vampire bat. Largely due to her broad edicts and the decentralized nature of her faith, Zura's followers spread over a wide variety of classes and archetypes. Clerics are well represented in the church, with an even mix of cloistered, war priest, and battle harbingers among them. Blight mystery oracles may be common as well, playing on Zura's themes of corruption. With their long lifespans and tendency toward charisma, many Moroi vampires might become bards who spin their songs and tales to lure victims to grisly ends. Vetalarana, meanwhile, might be silent whisper psychics who devour the minds of their victims. Witches with the mosquito patron could slightly reflavor their abilities to be bat-themed rather than insect-themed without many mechanical changes, and the paradox of opposites patron could be a good choice as well. Sorcerers devoted to the Queen of Vampires likely have the undead, shadow, or demonic bloodlines. Spellcasters in Zura's service might choose to embrace the heritage of the Strigoi by taking feats from the Shadowcaster archetype. Martial classes in service to Zura will likely specialize in one of two paths, maximizing the amount of bleed damage they can cause, or stalking and killing specific prey through the night. Fighters who wield weapons in the knife group, or with the wounding rune, will trigger plenty of critical hits to cause bleed damage, and flurry rangers could achieve similar results. The king of martial bleed damage, however, is the swashbuckler, with the bleeding finisher feat, which even pairs nicely with the rapier. Characters who focus on the stalking and killing of a single target might instead choose a precision ranger, a rogue of basically any racket, or even an investigator. Beyond these two broad categories, it could also be interesting to lean into more animalistic combat styles. One example might be the animal instinct barbarian, with the bat instinct, while another might be the claw dancer archetype. The shadow dancer could be a great pick for leaning into stealth, while the bounty hunter could be great at capturing victims for sacrifice during a later ritual. The medic archetype could be interesting from a roleplay perspective, since devout Zurans wouldn't be able to heal wounds without first consuming blood from them. I should also state here that, prior to the remaster, plenty of drow worshipped Zura, and especially the drow of House Resivrain in Sekamina. Because the drow are no longer canon, and we haven't gotten many details on the political situation in the Darklands since the remaster, it's difficult to say if any other Darklands dwellers will find her faith in the drow's place. Followers of Zura are predators, first and foremost. They see themselves as the top members of the social order and the food chain, and lesser beings exist only to be exploited and consumed. They are fiercely competitive with one another, but would never put vampire kind as a whole at risk. Many are nobles, using their long lives to acquire wealth and prestige, which they can use to mask their murderous urges. Others are savage killers, stalking the night like animals in search of their next meal. Zura accepts followers from both categories, and shows no favor to one over the other. For GMs looking to incorporate Zura and her followers into a campaign, here are some ideas. As a demon lord, Zura doesn't have a unique race of divine servitor demons who are loyal only to her. Instead, she occasionally brings followers from the material plane to Nesh as a reward for good service, allowing them to prey upon or lead the mortals whom she has kidnapped from the universe. Nesh is also populated by many types of demons, especially those which feast upon blood. I haven't found a specific subset of demon who fits that description, but given that Zura has been described as a unique subspecies of succubus, I imagine that plenty of succubi and alu demons serve as her followers. Lilitu demons, with their specialization in corruption, might also serve her effectively. I haven't found any documentation describing the signs which Zura might use to communicate her favor or disfavor to followers. I'm going to propose some here now for inspiration purposes, but know that these are my suggestions, and not an official part of the lore. Zurans who earn their goddess's favor will likely find Zura's unholy symbol or her demonic rune appearing in any blood which they shed, either in stains on their clothes or in pools at their feet. They might also find themselves blessed with a flash of insight about where to find a particularly vulnerable victim, or an internal clock which always warns them of the approaching dawn. By contrast, those who displease Zura might find themselves unable to staunch a bleeding wound, or unable to sate their hunger, no matter how much blood they consume. Thinking of narratives which might suit the involvement of Zura and her followers, I want to start broad. I am a sucker for vampires, hence the shared theme of the videos for this month, and one of my favorite interpretations is the vampire as a metaphor for the ruling class. I am a firm believer that the main war we should all be fighting is the class war, and the archetypical Victorian vampire is the perfect metaphor for that conflict. In this conception, vampires are wealthy, well-connected, and generally noble, and wield tremendous magical and physical power. All of this comes at the expense of their victims, generally poor workers who lack any means of meaningfully defending themselves. The blood of the poor literally sustains the elites. You could do a lot with this. Now, if I'm telling a story like this, then all subtlety is going out the window. I'm a firm believer that subtext is for cowards. A vampire in a story like this is some nightmarish combination of Bezos, Zuck, and Musk, and he got his vampirism and his castle from his rich dad. He's got his lapdogs, the owner of the local horse dealership, the Abadar-worshipping sheriff and his lackeys, and the drugged-out town crier who's just asking questions. You know the types. Meanwhile, the heroes are the workers. Field laborers, traders, blacksmiths, scribes, hunters, artists, woodcutters, and the like. They're poor. They come from all over the place and are members of lots of ancestries, from human and halfling to orc and goblin. Half of them are country dwellers who worship Erastil, and the other half are city folk who worship gods like Shelyn or Arshay. Honestly, they probably don't think they have that much in common. But they've all lost someone they love to the vampire, and the adventure kicks off in earnest when they all come to that realization. With torches and pitchforks, the heroes lead the civilians against their overlords. The sheriff and his men are just a few mortals, after all. They aren't the majority, or even the strong minority. And the vampire, well, he's just one man. He doesn't have friends. Everything he has was purchased with money or fear, and when the people aren't afraid anymore, they realize his money could just be taken away. Maybe a diplomat from Irison could provide them some suggestions on how it could be better distributed. Okay, now that I've triggered the shittiest people in my audience into either clicking off the video or leaving impotent complaints in the comments, let me continue with some less self-indulgent and more lore-based suggestions. Thinking small scale, it might be fun for a city-based adventure to use a Zura-worshipping serial killer as the villain for a relatively short investigation story. The PCs could play a group of Town Watch officers or detectives investigating a series of murders or disappearances. The presence of large quantities of blood, coupled with maybe demonic runes, or a drawn holy symbol of Zura, or maybe other vampiric paraphernalia, might eventually lead them to suspect a vampire. The twist, however, is that this villain is actually a mortal man, a follower of Zura who is seeking vampirism, but has no way to transform himself. This, coincidentally, provides him cover from the PC's investigations, as he's able to exist in sunlight, possibly temporarily clearing him of suspicion. This could be a fun way to play with the specificity of Zura's edicts, and the fact that she will accept non-vampires into her faith, as long as they're attempting to achieve vampiric status. At a much higher level, Zura's faith is prominent on both the Isle of Terror and in Geb, though she's not the major deity worshipped in either region. I like the idea of exploring the structure of Zura's church in a region where it doesn't need to hide, to see what narrative elements rise to the surface when secrecy is no longer the top priority. Some of this is explored in the Bloodlord's adventure path, so that could be a point of inspiration if you're interested in this. I like to imagine that backstabbing, politicking, and social climbing become the name of the game in these situations, and that could be a lot of fun to explore. I think the more interesting of the two locations I mentioned is certainly the Isle of Dread, for the simple reason that the Whispering Way is actively seeking to eliminate all life on Golarion. This would leave the vampires aligned with the Way with no access to food, condemning them to a long, slow death of starvation. What is the thought process for vampires who serve Tar-Baphon? Are they deluding themselves into thinking he will let them keep some mortals around as cattle? Are they in denial about his goals? Or do they simply think that he will never manage to achieve his goal, so working with him is just a convenient excuse to find allies and security? All of this could make for rich storytelling, and could be fun for both villainous PCs to participate in, or heroic PCs to infiltrate and exploit. Finally, probably the most interesting facet of the lore surrounding Zura is her connection to ancient Aslant. Not many published APs focus on ancient Aslant, so this could be a fun opportunity to get creative with things like ancient Magitech, clockwork, and recreating your favorite scenes from Atlantis: The Lost Empire. The Shades of Blood adventure path, released earlier this year, experimented with some of these ideas, but in my mind it didn't quite nail the mix or stick the landing. You could take the central conceit of that AP and go wild with it, but there's one other tidbit in the lore which I've found which could be a good jumping off point. On the eastern edge of the Bandu Hills in Garund, well into the heart of the Mwangi Expanse, a statue stands upon a base of stone which appears to have been cut from the top of some nearby hill or mountain. The statue depicts a man with Aslanti features and clothing pointing to the southwest, and it is cut from a stone which has never been found in the Mwangi Expanse or anywhere else in Garund. The statue bears an inscription upon its chest: "I point the way to Zura Kai, never there to return." The lore isn't clear about the language in which the script was written. Speculations about the nature of this statue run rampant among the historical and archaeological communities, but some rumors claim that Zura Kai is an ancient Aslanti city, founded by cultists of Zura who fled their homeland not long after Zura's ascension. No such city has ever been found, and no artifacts demonstrating Aslanti influence have ever turned up in the region. Complicating matters, the statue was likely moved from its original position, either by natural or man-made processes, and could very well no longer be pointing in the right direction. It could be fun to develop an adventure focused on the discovery and exploration of the mythical Zura Kai by agents from the Magambia, the local peoples of Vidrian and the broader Mwangi Expanse, and the Pathfinder Society. You take all the fun of Indiana Jones and Atlantis, cut out the colonialism, and add vampires. What's not to love? Sources and additional reading. The primary source for this video was The Broken Palace, Book 2 of the Shades of Blood adventure path, released earlier this year. This book provides a 6-page rundown of Zura's faith and her history, and it is the single most thorough source of information on the Queen of Vampires. Significant supplementary information came from the following secondary sources. Divine Mysteries gives an overview of Zura as a demon lord, as well as a look at the Children of the Night pantheon. Lords of Chaos, the second part of the Book of the Damned collection from 1st edition, provides a look at Zura and her history, and provides her 1E stats as a high-level creature. And The Flooded Cathedral, Book 3 of the Ruins of Aslant AP from 1st edition, provides an examination of Zura's Aslanti history. Additionally, a small amount of information came from a few tertiary sources. Both Faiths of Corruption from 1E and The Book of the Dead from 2E provide brief summaries of Zura's faith. The Inner Sea Races book from 1E briefly discusses the Orcs of Belkzen, who follow the Queen of Vampires. Legacy of the Lost God, Book 2 of the Extinction Curse AP, provides some information on Zulgaths, who follow Zura. Finally, the 1E sourcebook Heart of the Jungle provides some information on followers of Zura in the Mwangi Expanse. Please note, however, that Heart of the Jungle in particular is pretty outdated, and is likely no longer in line with Paizo's intended canon, even if specific passages haven't been explicitly retconned yet. So, that's it. That's Zura, the Queen of Vampires, goddess of vampirism, cannibalism, and blood drinking. She is fantastically villainous, and fully fits the narrative need for a god of predatory, exploitative, and violent vampires. She works well for both noble vampires and animalistic butchers, making her somewhat versatile from a storytelling standpoint. Overall, I really like her as a villain. She has a lot of overlap with Urgathoa, but is more specific in a way which I strongly prefer. This is the second video in my Halloween lineup for this month, in which I'm taking an exhaustive look at vampirism in the Pathfinder setting. In 2 weeks, I'll be back with the last video in this series, a look at the other major vampire deity on Golarion, Nin, the Immaculate Solution. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.